Well, as Leon said, my name is Devon Ragen, and I'm a research associate at Montana State. For the last almost 10 years, I have been doing research that looks at integrating livestock into cropping systems. And so we have done a lot of really cool projects. I'm going to focus on one specific one today, but I thought I'd tell you first just a little bit about the background on the research that we're doing. We are mostly using sheep. We have about 700 ewes at our Red Bluff Research Station in Bozeman, or right outside of Bozeman, in Norris, Montana. And then we have our Fort Ellis Research Station, which is on the east side of Bozeman, and we have anywhere from 100 to 200 rams and wethers there at a time to use for research purposes. So we've got a pretty good flock of sheep, and we have done everything from cover crop grazing to using sheep for weed management, grazing crop residues, and also kind of some fun experiments with market gardens. So if you guys are familiar with the Town's Harvest Market Garden there at the Bart Farm in Bozeman, a few years ago, just kind of for a fun experimental project, we put sheep out on their market gardens, and they had harvested most of the vegetables but left quite a few other vegetable residues and some whole vegetables out there. And we put sheep out there just to be able to see what they would eat. And it was really fun for me as a researcher to just get to observe the sheep and watch what they would consume and what they stayed away from. Some of the sheep were not as smart and would go up to a whole head of cabbage, and instead of picking off the leaves would just try to mouth the whole hard top of the cabbage. Some of the sheep were really smart though and actually learned to put the corn stalks in between their front legs, and they would walk down the corn stalk, consume all the leaves, consume the top of the corn stalk, keep walking, and it would just pop up behind them. They were grazing everything out there from cilantro, which was really interesting because all of the sheep started to smell like cilantro, which makes me as a researcher start thinking, well, can we get them to graze rosemary or mint? And would that flavor their meat? And they have done a little bit of research on if the effect of what they're eating has, or if what they're eating has an effect on their meat profile. But again, as I've talked to a couple people here, really what we can do depends on what grants we can get funding for. So we're really lucky to be able to have this grant funded through WSARE to look at integrating livestock into vegetable cropping systems. And so our research objectives for this study was to compare grazed soil to ungrazed soil and see if there is a difference in the microbial diversity and soil organic matter. And so what we did was we found 3 farmers interested in cooperating with us. We have 2 in Bozeman, actually 1 in Bozeman, 1 in Belgrade, Montana, and then we have 1 down in Boulder, Colorado. Our producers in Bozeman, we have Strike Farms. I don't know if anyone's heard of Strike Farms. They had a really successful CSA. They sold a lot of food and produce at farmers markets. They even sold, they had a flower garden that they sold. They're beautiful, beautiful bouquets to the public. They actually stopped operating this last summer, but we have 1 more data sampling to do this spring for all of our producers. So hopefully we'll be able to just go on. They're not operating, but everything was left as is. We'll run on and take our soil samples that we need. So that was Dylan Strike at Strike Farms. It was a very, very cool operation. They did not own their own sheep flock. So for this operation, we actually used MSU sheep and hauled them to their fields and did a grazing period and then took them back to MSU. One of our other cooperators was 13 Mile Lamb and Wool, which is in Belgrade, Montana, and that was operated by Becky Weed, or is operated by Becky Weed. They raise lamb for wool and meat, and then also have some organic gardens, and their main produce was squash the last couple years that we've done crop residue grazing at their place. Our last cooperator is Black Cat Farms in Boulder, Colorado, and they have a super cool operation. They raise pretty much every produce that you can think of. They have peanuts, they tried peanuts, I guess. They said peanuts didn't work very well, but they have all types of vegetables and herbs. They also raise geese, hogs, and sheep that all go into their 2 high-end restaurants in Boulder, Colorado. So that's Eric and Jill Skoken, and Eric is not only a farmer that owns and operates the farming aspect, but he's also a chef. So he kind of switches hats. He farms during the day, and then he goes to his very high-end, amazing restaurants, puts a chef hat on, and prepares meals for everyone there. I don't know how he has enough time in the day, but very, very cool operation to have everything just farm to table right there on both of his operations. So what we did at these operations is we wanted to be able to compare the grazed land to the ungrazed land. So we picked specific fields that each farmer has that they were okay with grazing livestock on or planned on grazing livestock on. And then we made these little 4-foot by 4-foot grazing exclosures with just hog panels and T-posts. We randomly placed those around the field, and those were our ungrazed areas where the sheep could not access. And then we picked some paired sampling areas to each of the 6 grazing exposures where we could take our grazed soil samples. So we took samples before and after grazing, either in the ungrazed area or in the somewhere else where the sheep had access to in a paired grazed area. And then we could compare those and see if there's any differences in microbial communities as well as soil nutrients. What we found, and so let me make sure I'm on the right track here. Oh, we also did bulk density samples. So a lot of times integrating livestock into a farming system, kind of the biggest or one of the biggest roadblocks that farmers see is that they're worried about compaction. And they see livestock being out in the fields and that soil is looking really compacted, and they're worried that with all that soil compaction, you're going to have problems with root growth and those roots getting nutrients for the plants, and they're just not going to be able to grow the same crops and get the same yields as they could before introducing livestock. So we have done a couple research projects prior to this looking at soil compaction in relation to livestock being on the fields. And the biggest issue we found is having livestock out on the fields during a really wet season. And that is when you get a little bit of compaction. But what we have seen is that the compaction is just on the very top surface of the soil. And if you use a soil pentrometer, which we use, it measures the kilograms of force that is needed to push this probe into the ground, so it lets us know how compacted it is. If we use that soil pentrometer, that very top crust is compacted, but the soil underneath that would be feeding the plant roots and letting the plant roots get nutrients are actually not being impacted. One problem we did have though with that top crust is when we wanted to direct seed. So we tried, and this is a separate project. There's I could talk about the sheep and soil stuff for hours. So I'm sorry if I go off on a little tangent here, but one of the problems we had with direct seeding without tilling is that drill just would bounce off that surface. And so that is a problem that we found with integrating livestock, but there are ways around it. And I know Leon mentioned too that maybe we can just till a little strip where we need to seed. In different cases, there's ways to work around it, and they are not impacting that soil underneath. Especially up in the western US where we have freeze and thaw cycles, that soil is really reset every year, just naturally. So especially in the springtime where that soil is freezing and thawing and refreezing and thawing, it's naturally getting reset and breaking up a little bit of compaction that way as well. So all the soil samples that we took, jumping back to our cropping systems integrating livestock project here, the soil samples that we took in the grazed areas and the ungrazed areas, we sent off to a lab for microbial DNA extraction and also to look at soil nutrient profiles. So we could compare before the animals went on that pasture and after. And we've actually been doing this for the last 3 years. So going on to 4 here, this spring will be our final data collection, and we'll be able to analyze our data and get final results. But what we found looking at the microbial community populations is that the diversity of the microbes was increased over time. And so from our very first sample that we took to the first year and the second year, we did see an increase in diversity over time. However, we did not see a difference between the ungrazed and the grazed. And I think this is due to the fact that producers, after putting their livestock on these fields, actually went through and tilled the whole field. So we had our exclosures out there, we took our sample, and then they had sheep out there and grazed. We took our last sample, and after we pulled out our exclosures for the year, they went through and tilled. And so I think, and really the point of our project here, when we're cooperating with farmers, we're not trying to change anything the farmers are doing or tell them what to do. We just want to collect data from what is currently going on at their operation. And so we can't tell them, well, don't till, we want to see what happens if you don't till. They wanted to till, and so that's what happened. And I think when you look at our 4x4 grazing exclosures, tilling through that right into our grazed area probably kind of mixed up those samples. But the fact that we did see an increase in diversity over time by just having the sheep out on the field is a really good sign. When we looked at bulk density though, bulk density was our measurement of compaction on these fields. And for all three of our operations, bulk density increased in both the ungrazed and grazed treatments, and regardless of the fact that they were tilling. And so as a researcher, you really want to be able to pinpoint that on something. Well, why is it getting compacted on the ungrazed and the grazed, and why is it compacted even though they're tilling that top surface? And we just took our bulk density samples from the top 3 inches. So it's just something that warrants more research, is what we always like to say. Well, I don't know why it happens. We have to do more research. But that was a little disappointing. You know, we're really hoping, at least I'm really hoping, that integrating livestock is going to have just positive effects all around. But we did see an increase in the compaction for ungrazed and grazed treatments. At 13 Mile, the one in Belgrade, we saw no change in soil nutrients. And if you look at the organic matter and the nitrogen, there was no change. Again, I hate to say this, but at our Black Cat Farm in Boulder and Strike Farms in Bozeman, we actually saw organic matter and nitrogen decrease. And so again, why is that happening? And it wasn't related to treatment, so it wasn't that the ungrazed was decreasing and the grazed was increasing, or vice versa, but over time, that organic matter and nitrogen was decreasing on those farms. So just to kind of wrap it up, and then I have another project I want to talk about briefly, but we did see diversity increase, the microbe diversity increase over time on these farms by having those livestock on the fields. Soil nutrients either decreased on 2 properties or didn't change at all. And really, I think when we're looking at soil over time, the soil communities can take decades to change. I mean, a really long time. And so when we're just looking at a 3-year period, it's going to be difficult for us to really be able to say, well, livestock are helping or livestock are not helping, especially when there's so many confounding factors from the environment. But we're hoping we have one more soil collection to do this spring, and then we'll have our complete data set to analyze and look at, and hopefully we'll see some more positive attributes of having livestock out there. One project I really want to mention that I just think is really cool, so I wanted to make sure we had a little bit of time. I know we're running a little bit behind. But we did what I like to call a feedlot on fields project. So this took place at Fort Ellis and Bozeman, where we had 3 different treatments. We have 45 research plots out there that are a 1/3 acre each, and we have them divided into 15 plots, either under conventional treatment where we use herbicides, a tilled organic treatment, or a grazed organic treatment. And we have wheat stubble fields out there. And so after harvesting the wheat, we actually put weaned lambs out on these fields and finished them for 60 days. I built some little lamb feeders. They were actually made out of hog feeders, but I put them onto skids, and I could hook up a tow rope and drag them around the little fields with a gator or an ATV. And we offered the lambs either a barley pellet to mimic more of a traditional feedlot diet that's grain-based, or an alfalfa-based pellet to mimic a forage diet. And we compared lambs offered these finishing diets on the fields to lambs finished on the same feed in confinement. And we took soil samples before and after on the grazed fields, as well as the wheat fields that were treated conventionally or just with tillage. And what we found in regards to lamb performance is that lambs actually performed better out on the fields than in confinement. And lambs on the fields, just observation, those lambs that were out on the fields were running and playing, and I don't know how many times I had to pick up their mineral feeders, and they just had a lot of fun running back and forth out there. But they actually had higher average daily gain and bigger ribeyes out in the field than lambs that were in confinement, consuming the exact same diet. And I know we can't measure happiness in research. You know, you could measure stress levels with cortisol tests or something, but just observation as a researcher, the lambs were obviously happier out in the fields, even though one of the years we had it was -20 for about a week straight. I was trying to hot water out to lambs, and I'd get hot water from our lab at the research station into a tank, and by the time I got out to the field to try to get it into their water tank, it was frozen. So even though they had really more difficult weather complications, those lambs still finished better than ones that were in confinement. When we look at the soil microbial communities, we actually did have more diversity in the tilled and grazed organic plots than we did in the conventional plots. And that's a little bit interesting, because when we think of tillage, we mostly think of the disruption of the soil communities, but the soil tended to be similar in our grazed and tilled treatments, and the conventional treatments lacked diversity. So it's pretty interesting observations. And we're still working on our results from both of these studies, and hopefully we'll have those in the next year.
You talked about compaction with your sheep. Have you looked at breaking up that compaction within the vegetation plots that you have?
The compaction research that we've done at Fort Ellis, they're all annual crops. And so the project that we did, we tried to completely eliminate tillage from our grazed organic plots, and then we could compare that to our tilled organic plots and compare that to a minimum till chemical treatment. And what we found it was actually a 5-year study. So on our grazed organic plots, we used sheep in every way that we could. And so it was a 5-year crop rotation. We put sheep in there for weed management. We put sheep in there to graze cover crops. We had, towards the end of our study, we had a lot of weed pressure. And if we lost a crop, instead of just going through and mowing it and before it could drop seed, we used it for forage value. So put sheep out there to graze it down. And what we found over those 5 years is that we could eliminate tillage 3 of the 5 years. And we called that a success. And the weed pressure got so heavy that eventually we did have to till in those graze organic plots. But if you can eliminate tillage for 3 years in a row, we were direct seeding into our plots. And
Direct seeding what?
Direct seeding
What?
wheat.
Wheat.
Let me think of what our rotation was. We had sweet clover, yellow sweet clover as a cover crop. We had lentils, 2 years of winter wheat, and then a safflower undersown with sweet clover. And the sweet clover that we used for a cover crop, the first couple years, it was kind of a little bit of trial and error on when we should graze it. And it is a biennial, but we were worried that if we didn't graze it heavy enough, that we'd end up with sweet clover coming up the next couple years. But it is an obligate biennial, and we were able to terminate it. The first year we just grazed it down to absolutely nothing, but we made the mistake of letting that sweet clover get to 6 or 7 feet tall before turning sheep in there. And some of the stalks were so woody and dense that the sheep we had to leave the sheep in there for a long time. They were very unhappy with us. And they eventually grazed the majority of it. But the following years, when we grazed our sweet clover, I've got way off topic. I'm sorry. I know this is about compaction, but the following years with the sweet clover, we ended up actually going in and grazing. Instead of just one grazing period, we were able to put sheep back on those plots 5 or 6 times throughout the summer. So we increased the grazing period, gave the sheep really high quality forage to consume numerous times over the summer instead of waiting until that sweet clover was really mature and then grazing it. But to get back to your compaction, the livestock, anything you do on the land is going to compact it in some way. Vehicle traffic, even just people walking on harvesting. If you're harvesting by hand, you're going to compact the soil. But livestock, they might be compacting the soil, but you have to consider what they're adding to it as well. And so they're walking around and their manure is going back into the soil as well. In the feedlot on fields case, since we were bringing in supplemental feed, they weren't taking anything away from those fields, so they were only adding to it. So it's kind of a win-win in that situation. But how we manage, I have horses on my personal property, and how we manage compaction, we clean the horse. They're on dry lot for the majority of the year, and we clean the horse pen every single day, and then we use a manure spreader every year and spread it back out on the pasture. And we are irrigated now. When we moved in, it hadn't been grazed in probably 8 years, and they hadn't had any livestock on the property. And our pastures look better now that we've had horses grazing on it and spreading the manure than they ever have before. So you can definitely see a benefit. We can actually see a neighboring property right across the fence has the same thing. They haven't touched it. It's just a grass pasture. And it's pretty cool to see that our pasture that we graze our horses on, we probably have double the amount of grass on our field at prime grazing time than they do on their untouched field. So it's kind of cool to see.
You move them around.
Yeah, we try to avoid having our horses out in bad weather. They can go out in the winter time, but come springtime, we don't let them go out on the field when it's wet, because they'll just tear up all that grass and compact it. And we try to be careful throughout the summer. We definitely do a take half, leave half. And so we don't let them graze it down. We leave at least 50%, and that way that grass can lay down and provide kind of a buffer on the soil to feed the microbes and add that additional organic matter and protect that soil as well, so it can help prevent a little bit of compaction. I kind of answer your question in a roundabout way.